Somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a massive oil tanker cuts through dark water, carrying enough crude oil to fuel an entire city for weeks. At gas stations across America, prices flicker on digital signs. On Wall Street, traders stare at screens watching every headline. A potential deal between the United States and Iran is sending shockwaves through global energy markets, and the question on every investor's mind is simple. How low could oil prices actually go? The Middle East sits at the center of this story, specifically a narrow strip of water called the Strait of Hormuz. This waterway, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is the single most important oil choke point on the planet. Nearly 20% of all global oil supply passes through it every single day. When tensions rise between Washington and Tehran, tankers slow down, insurance costs spike, and oil prices climb. When diplomacy moves forward, the opposite can happen. And right now, diplomacy is moving. To understand why this deal matters, you have to understand what Iran controls geographically. The country sits along the entire northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has previously threatened to close this waterway during periods of maximum pressure, a move that would immediately trigger a global energy crisis. 17 million barrels of oil pass through that strait every single day. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates all depend on it to export their oil. A disruption there does not just affect the Middle East. It affects every driver filling up their tank in Ohio, Texas, and California. Negotiations between United States officials and Iranian representatives have been quietly intensifying. Multiple rounds of indirect talks, facilitated through Omani intermediaries, have produced what sources describe as a preliminary framework. The deal reportedly involves Iran agreeing to significant limits on its nuclear enrichment program in exchange for meaningful sanctions relief. American officials have confirmed that discussions are at a more advanced stage than at any point in the last several years. Both governments appear motivated, Iran by economic desperation, and the United States by a desire to stabilize energy markets before the next election cycle. One of the most significant components under discussion involves approximately $100 billion in Iranian assets that have been frozen in foreign banks due to American sanctions. A portion of these funds could be released in phases as Iran demonstrates compliance with nuclear restrictions. Additionally, sanctions relief could allow Iranian oil to re-enter global markets legally. Iran currently produces around 3 million barrels per day, but could potentially increase that output significantly if sanctions are lifted. More supply entering the market means downward pressure on prices, which is exactly what American consumers have been hoping for at the pump. The nuclear dimension of these talks cannot be understated. Iran has enriched uranium to 60% purity, dangerously close to the 90% threshold required for weapons-grade material. International inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency have reported limited access to Iranian facilities. Any final agreement would require Iran to roll back enrichment levels, accept intrusive inspections, and dismantle certain centrifuge configurations. In return, the United States would provide legally binding guarantees of sanctions relief. Critics in Washington argue that no deal can be trusted without ironclad verification mechanisms built directly into the agreement's architecture. Financial markets did not wait for a signed agreement. The moment credible reports of advanced negotiations surfaced, oil futures dropped by nearly $3 per barrel within 48 hours. Brent crude, the global benchmark, slid below $80 per barrel briefly. Energy stocks dipped, while airline stocks and consumer discretionary sectors gained. Investors were pricing in the possibility of additional Iranian supply hitting global markets within months. Goldman Sachs analysts noted that a full sanctions removal could add 1 million additional barrels per day to global supply, potentially pushing prices down further. Beyond oil prices, a normalized relationship between Washington and Tehran would reshape global shipping patterns. Currently, many international companies avoid Iranian ports entirely due to secondary sanctions risk. A deal would reopen those trade corridors, reducing shipping distances for certain Asian exporters and lowering freight costs across multiple industries. European energy companies, particularly those in Germany and Italy, have already begun preliminary discussions about re-engaging with Iranian energy infrastructure projects that were abandoned when the original nuclear deal collapsed in 2018. Despite the optimism in certain diplomatic circles, significant obstacles remain. Hardline factions within Iran's government have publicly opposed any agreement that they perceive as surrendering leverage. In Washington, congressional opposition is fierce, with several senators threatening to introduce legislation that would block any executive agreement from taking effect. Israel has communicated serious reservations through back channels, warning that any deal which leaves Iranian nuclear infrastructure intact creates unacceptable long-term security risks. The window for a deal exists, but it is narrow and it could close quickly. The coming weeks will determine whether this diplomatic opening becomes a historic agreement or another missed opportunity. If a deal is reached, American consumers could see measurable relief at the gas pump within several months as additional Iranian barrels enter the market. If talks collapse, oil prices could spike sharply as geopolitical risk premiums return. The Strait of Hormuz will remain the world's most watched waterway, regardless of the outcome. Global energy security, American foreign policy, and your monthly gas bill are all connected to what happens in those negotiating rooms. The question is not just whether a deal gets done. It is whether the world is ready for what comes after. Could this deal lower gas prices? Drop your opinion in the comments below.